such a difference, isn't it? You know, the good policy process that, well, they were both good policy processes,
they were.
but the one that worked and the one that didn't. And so why did one work and why did one not work? Can I just say, before we discuss this, I want to give thanks to Meredith, who pointed this out to me, that we've actually got a good article that might help us inform this, and the collection of lectures from Gary. The first one, actually, is about what we can learn from independent reviews in supporting public policy, so you might want to think about that, look at that one. But before I open up for questions, it seems to me that, you know, when we think about what might be influential here, it is where government is and the role of government. It is how you do it, how you run it. It is where the community is when you start, you know, the community framing, how it's framing. So you've got at least three, you know, where the community is, how you do it, where government is. It seems to me from those two examples you've given me that the big difference was a disconnect between where government was in relation to your review. You know, where government was in relation to the Garnaut review, where the Rudd government was, whereas where the government was in relation to your review, Bob. I know that, you know, they had set it up. I know that. So is that the big disconnect? Is that the big difference? Could you just make a comment and then we'll...
Could I make an observation of whether or not this is a reason for the difference?
Yep.
Every country has to have a tax system to raise revenue, and they've been established for a long, long period of time. So it's not so controversial, I think, to review a tax system as opposed to introducing something fundamentally quite different, is dealing with carbon emissions, and that is quite a new, that's a somewhat more radical shift in policy. I don't think it's that controversial, but it is quite new. So that's one difference. Second, and perhaps it's related to this, there was nervousness by the national government about where our review was going, but they didn't interfere. They let it go. And they were prepared to rethink their prior views. And the Prime Minister, I think, deserves a lot of credit for wanting to read our report and take it away and think about it himself and say, will this convince me? And he was prepared to say, yes, I am convinced that the shift is the tax switch idea. So the way in which the politicians confronted it, but maybe that's because one is, because of the topics even. So I just make that observation.
And I certainly agree with the second point. On the first point that, you know, everyone has a tax policy, that's true, but I'd also argue that people don't march in the streets demanding changes to the tax policy. They were marching in the streets both physically and metaphorically for a climate change policy, a government response or national response to climate change. So I'm not sure exactly what that adds, but it is
Well, I wasn't here to see that, so that's a very interesting observation. Yeah.
Okay, Meredith, and then over the back there. Do you want to, well, maybe we'll wait for that.
Sorry. Meredith Edwards, University of Canberra, and thank you for the two case studies. I thought they were both fascinating in themselves, and the contrast is one that we'll keep discussing. And I couldn't help thinking, what if we hadn't had a tax system and we were about to introduce it? How emotive would we get about that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. My question is mainly to you, Bob, because it's about, I'm interested in how you did the communicate, which is the novel sort of element. It's the process.
Right.
And I vaguely remember, I think it might have been your finance minister talking about something going online, and that might have had to do with the welfare reform. I just can't remember. But what did you, I don't think you had an issues paper, but was there one? What did you do online? What sort of were the mechanics of it that you think made it successful? And the other question was, where was the opposition in all of this? Where was the contestation around the ideas, and how did you deal with them?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I didn't have time to elaborate From the outset, even before we got underway, we decided that we would create a website where all the background papers, everything we discussed at each meeting would be online after the meetings. We summarised the discussion in the meetings. That was all online. What is more, we brought on board a communications advisor to try and design a way to engage with the media. We wanted the issues to get out there, and I think we owe a lot of credit to that communications advisor, actually. I learned a lot about communicating through the media through this person. That's one part of it, and as a group, the review team were all in agreement that is what we should do. But also, we had on the group people who are very well respected as tax accountants, tax lawyers through the country, highly respected people. And they were giving talks. It wasn't just me giving talks. I must have given 20 or so talks through the country that year. But so were other members of the panel. And they were talking to the business community. They were talking to their clients if they were in accounting firms. There's a huge amount of engagement right across the panel. But from what Ron described, maybe that's not too different. You put everything online. You had a lot of engagement. I was very keen to ensure it wasn't seen as my review. A couple of times I was interviewed and they said, "Oh, is this the Buckle Review?" No, this is not. We call it the Tax Working Group. And I was maybe that was for self-preservation, not sure where this was going to go, but I didn't want it to be seen as driven by one individual. It was the team that was driving it. And so it was a team effort to get the communication, but also the internet, hugely useful to help get material out there. Beg pardon? Oh, the opposition were immensely interested. I had a lot of discussions with opposition politicians, and they were, they had different views about they had their views about where the reforms should go, but they were immensely interested in the whole process. And interestingly, there wasn't really a great deal of torpedoes coming across the process. So they had bought into it, and I think maybe that helped because perhaps the government of the time figured, well, there's general buy-in of the need to reform the tax system. There was debate about precisely what are the best options. Now, the Sanford criteria, there's a criteria, has this been sustained? There's been basically no change to what was introduced in the 2010 budget. There was debate, should we introduce a comprehensive capital gains tax? There is capital gains tax if you're selling assets as part of your business, it's treated as income. If it's a regular process, for instance. But that debate has waned in New Zealand. There was another option, base broadening through a land tax, and that really didn't get any traction. And both of those ideas were ideas where the group couldn't form a consensus around. So, a team effort.
Did you want to say anything about the role of the opposition in relation to yours, or is it?
I just observed that almost identical. They were interested, not obstructionist.
Okay.
And we were briefing them on occasion, not just the opposition, but all parties.
Yep.
Tim O'Loughlin from Carnegie Mellon University. I'd just like to have a go at answering your question, Alison, with two other variables. The first is I think Shakespeare's got a great deal to teach us about all this, particularly about timing. I know more about Ron's case than I know about the New Zealand tax case, so I'll only make one observation there, and that was when the Rudd government was elected in 2007 and the Garnaut report was being prepared, there were a lot of people out there who wanted to get engaged. They wanted to get involved, and the time taken had an effect, in my judgment, of dissipating a lot of that energy. So there was a trade-off there between the rational and scientific approach versus delivering. And then, for the record, the final scheme actually prevented people's individual actions from being taken into account. So that any dissipating that was left to do was done by that design feature at that point. So, and just listening to Bob's presentation, it seems to me that the timing and the planets aligning has got to be part of the answer. The other part of the answer is both speakers referred to rationality. I can't help myself here. Rationality has got to be used with great care, I think, because what's rational to you is lunacy to me, and vice versa. And no one's got a mortgage on rationality. And I think when as policymakers are conducting these sorts of processes and they say, well, ours is going to be rational, they need to be conscious of the element of subjectivity in the use of that term. So I'm just be interested in any comments.
I won't comment on the first yet. Timing, maybe it all took too long. That is definitely a subjective assessment. On the second one about rationality, just to point out, I referred to rationality, and then I qualified that by talking about scientific and economic method, which is well-established principles of how you go about collecting evidence and then making inferences from that evidence and making those inferences clear. We did our best. Did we do as well as we could? Could we have done better? Maybe, but we think we did as well as we could. So rationality, I think the rational person would think rationality is a fairly objective measure, but maybe that's a self-serving definition.
Can I comment on the rationality point? The way in which I'm using this phrase is really in this way, and it's rather different, I think, in the two interpretation. That you make clear the criteria against which you're assessing a policy review. And you can debate what should be in there. Having done that, you then assess the options weigh them up. And then you let basically the people's representatives decide what trade-offs they want to choose. It's used in that sense. And that, in other words, you're giving them a framework in which to make a judgment based on their values, not our values, on the politicians, the public's values. We're not there to say what values they should adopt. We're simply saying if you have those values, they may be the way the tax system influences the distribution of income. If they want to put a lot of weight on that, that's fine. But our job, and I think it sounds like this is the way Ron approached it, is to say, if you adopt this set of changes, it'll have these effects on the distribution of income, these effects on efficiency, these administrative costs, but you make the choice. And we made that very clear in our report. So we didn't push hard on any set of options. We did signal the way in which we thought it should go, but we made it very clear this is a framework to make decisions around trying to improve. So that's the way in which I'm using the term.
Actually, I'd like to, sorry, Bob, if I could just jump in. An issue that sort of became more evident probably after our review than during our review is this debate around giving equal airtime to all sides of the debate. And the Australian newspaper particularly pursues this. Now, if you've got, say, 99% of the scientific community, at least the peer-reviewed scientific community, saying, look, there's sufficient evidence that, something's happening, do you give that 99% weighting in your gathering of evidence, or do you take the Australian's point of view? No, you've got to give all sides, 50-50 share airtime in the presentation of the facts. I don't have an answer to that, but it is, I think, actually an interesting challenge, and one that I think, for now at least, damages any possibility of a proper debate on climate change.
Now we've got at least two more questions before we finish in 6 minutes' time. So one here and then one at the back.
Thank you. Andrew Tideswell, Statistics New Zealand. I'm interested in the comparison and around the the procedures and so forth and the outcomes of the two different pieces of work. And I'm wondering about actually not, I guess, the strategic work around this, but actually the tactical things that went on. So, for example, a good lawyer will often say, don't legislate in response to, you know, a major emotive event or crisis, you end up with often more times than not with poor legislation. I'm wondering if somehow perversely, whether if work was done around policy and climate, you wouldn't really want to be doing it and highlighting it during a drought, because perversely, as soon as that ends, people will say, well, that was a weather event, because it's very, very common to confuse weather and climate. So it's the timing was important. It also struck me that in the tax area, one good thing, I suppose, or effective thing it seemed to happen there, was you brought in people who knew all about all the rorts, and knew how to, you know, basically milk the system and so forth. I don't know, and I wonder about how much consideration was given in the climate area about, you know, bringing in the petty thieves and the criminals, and their thinking, and really understanding that in that work. And then thirdly and lastly, I'm wondering about tactically how fairness, the idea of fairness, was played out. It seems to me that in the tax area, there was either implicit, you know, prior consideration and thought about, like, what's fair for people generally in society. I wonder whether the fairness element around what different players are doing in the climate space came into the discussion and the publicity. I just don't know. I'm just wondering about consideration of those three things.
So on the tactical, the number of, I didn't have to tell Ross this, but the number of times I told other politicians is, I said, don't mention the word drought in the same sentence as climate change. Right, so right onto that. But there were a lot of some more subtle elements to that. So we didn't talk about, you know, the hottest year, because of course if you talk about it being the hottest year, the next year as soon as it's not hot, oh, climate change is over. So we actually spoke a lot about trends. You know, that was that scientific language. I mean, I just gave one example up there about balance of probabilities. But I mean, that's what we were trying to move it away from. But the forces aligned against us, you know, in the media, in the political, you know, we lost, as I said. The petty thieves and criminals, they were invited in. We met with them. We invited them to submit. We put their papers, you know, on our website. We spoke about them. So they were there. Like I said, some of the less petty thieves, once the doors opened up for sort of back channels, not involving our review, they took those avenues. Fairness, yes, I think, I don't want to say this absolutely definitively, but I think we were the first to really put the fairness element on the table in the whole debate around climate change, at least in Australia. And so we devoted a number of chapters to the different effects of climate change on individuals, on communities, on industries, to really try and put that out there. And we came up with some suggestions about how they were dealt with, but we didn't weight those suggestions, if you like, in saying, because that ultimately is a political judgment, I suppose. So, no, it was very much in our thinking, and I think we were the first to really highlight it.
Did you want to add?
You're right. We did have people on our group who had very clear insight of the way in which the breaking of the alignment of the system and the opportunities to shift incomes to lower taxed entities. They had very clear insight by that, and they were very happy to expose it. And that helped with credibility.
Thank you.
Hi, Anne Cole from the Victorian Department of Economic Development. I started my career at a predecessor of the Productivity Commission doing the economic modelling, and there was the one big figure that got the headline, which gave the space for a lot of the discussion of the policy ideas and reforms that could be made. I'm just interested, Ron, I can't actually recall, did you do the one big figure of the economic impact, and was that a headline that enabled the more sophisticated policy discussion to flow, and if not, sort of just talk us through that maybe?
Yeah, well, let you in on a secret. At the start of the review, I actually said to Ross, why are we going to bother doing any modelling here? Right? Because you're modelling effects that are out decades, decades and decades and decades. And Ross rightly said, no, we're doing it because we need to do it. but we ran into that problem. You've got costs that start accruing pretty soon, benefits that only start accruing much later. And so we had a lot of trouble communicating that. And again, this is where if you go through it, the language, the scientific approach is very clear, it's very right, but it wasn't easily communicated. So I suppose we deliberately avoided having the number, because the number was never going to withstand the debate around all the assumptions that went into it. And all that would have achieved would have been to erode the credibility of the number and everything that stood behind it, i.e. the work of the review. So we didn't do that, but we did do a lot of modelling. We did put it in there. We did put in place a lot of explanation, but it was too hard to boil any of that down to a quick, sharp message, and we didn't try.
Okay, I think that's a good point to conclude on, because I think it's just about 2 o'clock. This has been a great discussion, sometimes deflating you when you think about how we missed an opportunity to achieve some change in relation to climate change, but it's really important that we understand the lessons, and I think those 4 lessons that you did draw out were really helpful, and also the uplifting example of being able to achieve some meaningful tax reforms from New Zealand. So can we thank our speakers again?